I once held a hunting lease in the middle of Georgia. It was an abandoned hunting camp that hadn't been used in several years. Now, I'm not superstitious at all, but this place was legitimately spooky. It was miles down an overgrown dirt road and completely surrounded by woods. It's probably the most secluded place I've ever been. I used to hunt there by myself a lot, and I always had this weird sense that I was never completely alone out there. One evening, I was hunting down in a small valley by a food plot we put that lines a creek bordering our property. From the minute I sat down, I had a weird gut feeling. Like, I wasn't in a safe place, even though I was holding a .308 with ballistic tipped rounds. I definitely didn't feel like I was the top predator out there, even though I should have been. I didn't see any deer while I was sitting in the stand, but the forest was abuzz with activity. Birds, squirrels, and other critters singing their normal evening symphony, and then all of a sudden, silence. Everything just seemed to stop all at once. The sound of the birds, the squirrels, everything. The forest was now dead silent. It felt like everything in the woods were looking right at me, or should I say, right through me. It was getting dark soon, and I was getting extremely creeped out, so I packed up my gear and started the walk back to the cabin. About 100 yards away, I had this feeling that something was creeping up behind me. I spun around and pointed my rifle back down the path where I just came from, and that's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, there was something standing in the middle of the path. It wasn't a person, but it didn't look like anything I've seen before. There was hardly any light to make out any features, but if I had to take a guess, I would say it looked like some kind of bipedal deer, and it was just standing there, staring at me. I fired a warning shot into the air, and the deer just stood there, before letting out one of the most gut-wrenching screams I've ever heard. That's when I booked it back to the cabin, packed up my stuff as quick as I could, and got the hell out of there. I just let the lease run out on that place after that, and I never went back. I had a really weird experience in Conagray National Park outside of Colombia last winter that made me want to share this story. For those that don't know, it's a beautiful boardwalk that goes through the swamps and the cypress forest in them. I lived in Columbia, South Carolina, and made frequent visits to the park, so I'm very familiar with the area. I would often jump the fence and walk the boardwalk at night, as it's super peaceful to walk the swamp and hear all the wildlife. They never have a ranger or guard there after hours, so I was always alone. The last time I did this was in October of 2021, and I was taking my usual stroll with my flashlight in hand. I should mention, between the insects and frogs, the sound is very loud, but then it completely stopped when I was about a mile in. I heard what I thought was my wife call me from the trail ahead, but she wasn't there. I was alone and she was out of town. I then heard water sloshing to my right and saw nothing with my flashlight, so I chalked it up to just being tired and kept moving. Shortly after, the wildlife started up again and everything was fine. About 15 minutes later, I noticed it got eerily quiet again and then heard swamp water sloshing on my left-hand side, but this time it was more deliberate, like somebody was walking or trudging through it, coming right in my direction. I was in a very thick section of the forest and couldn't see more than about 20 feet in front of me, but then I heard my wife's voice again. This time, I got chills. She wasn't with me and was out of town, and she certainly wasn't moving through a swamp at 1 o'clock in the morning. But then, just a few seconds later, I saw what looked like a human silhouette move between the trees for a split second, but it was off. It was very skinny, pale, and taller than me by at least 6 feet. I quickly noped the fuck out of there and ran almost 2 miles back to my truck and didn't slow down until I heard the wildlife again. Like I said, this is a boardwalk that's in a swamp in the middle of the South Carolina boonies, and nobody is walking around in that water at night without a light, or ever. Not to mention that I've spent my entire life outdoors and I've never seen or heard of any animal that big that walks in a bipedal pattern just like a human does. I'd also like to add that I wasn't under the influence of any substance that night, and although I was a tad bit tired, I wasn't nearly to the point of sleep deprivation or hallucinations, and this is by far one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me. I've been drawn to the paranormal since an early age. There was a small cemetery in rural Illinois that I'd go to at night to take pictures from grade school all the way through early college. It was fairly old, and there were graves from the 1800s as well as people from today. There weren't a lot of houses around either, just farms spread out across cornfields. Over the years, I've collected a few pictures of orbs and some mists, a few of which I'll show on screen now. I've had quite a few experiences as a result of some of these visits, and the one that makes me the most uncomfortable goes like this. This was in the early days of my excursions, so it was the middle of the night, and I was in the cemetery taking pictures with my father and younger brother. No strangeness or anything out of the ordinary occurred while we were there. It was just a cool night out in the country under a billion stars. When we got home, we put my dad's SD card in the computer and discovered that he'd gotten quite a good picture of a ghostly mist over a grave. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the picture, but it looked like you could have been holding a lit cigarette under the lens, and you get the idea. Not long after we discovered the picture, our dog started barking out of the window next to the computer, and he barked consistently for about 20 minutes. Now, it wasn't unusual for our dog to bark. That's what they do. They're dogs. However, I did notice the timing, and that's what made me uneasy. So, I went outside and looked around, but there was no squirrels or any other creatures of the night, and it was dead quiet. So, I went back inside, went to bed, and passed out. I woke up a few hours later, and when I looked at my red digital clock, it said that it was 3 a.m. on the dot. I sleep with no lights on, so my room was completely pitch black, but over the stillness of the night, I heard this very faint sliding sound. It was very smooth, like soft wood on carpet. My eyes were open, but my mind was mostly asleep, so I didn't really process the sound and quickly dozed back off. And this is where it gets creepy. The next morning when I woke up for school, I looked over at my desk in the corner of my room, and my chair had been pulled out and turned to face my bed perfectly. My desk was right next to the door in my room, and if the chair wasn't pushed in, then I wouldn't be able to get out, so I always kept it pushed in whenever I wasn't using it. The implication of that still gives me chills every time I think about it, and that experience changed the way I approach the paranormal. Ever since then, every time I'm about to leave a cemetery, I always say out loud in a very polite but firm way that potential spirits are not welcome to follow me home, and it's pretty much worked for me ever since. But this is by far the creepiest experience I've ever had with the paranormal. A few years ago, when my daughter was just a toddler, my wife and I used to take her to a nearby lake to picnic, swim, and just unwind in general. It was a nice peaceful spot. Quiet, not too crowded, the kind of place where you could easily forget about the world for a while. One afternoon, after we'd finished eating, my wife decided to go for a quick swim while I stayed on the beach with our daughter. I remember watching her wade out into the water, with the sun sparkling off the surface and a gentle breeze blowing, and everything felt at peace, until a minute later when she suddenly stopped and turned to me, frantically shouting something. At first, I couldn't make out what she said, but her expression was off. She looked really worried, almost sick, and then I clearly heard her say, "I think I just stepped on someone's face." I froze for a second, thinking maybe she was joking, but the look on her face wasn't playful. It was pale, and she looked terrified, and she quickly started making her way back to the shore, her legs carrying her faster than they could move, like she couldn't get out of the water fast enough. And when she got back to me, she was visibly shaken. She told me that while she was swimming, her foot brushed against something soft, and at first, she thought it was a rock or a weird patch of seaweed, but when she pressed her foot down, she felt the unmistakable shape of a face beneath the water. A nose, an eye socket, and she swore she felt the hollow of the eye. I considered going in to check it out, but something stopped me. The unease in my gut, maybe. We decided to pack up and leave right after that. The scariest part for me is the very next day, the local news reported that a young boy who had been missing for days was found drowned in the same lake not far from where we had been. He'd been there the whole time, just beneath the surface, and to this day, my wife is convinced that she stepped on his face. In 1980, a single mother named Dorothy Jane Scott started getting threatening phone calls at work. She paid the calls little attention until one night when the ominous voice on the other end instructed her to look outside, and on her car's windshield was a single withered rose. The stalker would alternate between declaring his love for her and making threats of physical harm. And although the caller's voice sounded familiar, Dorothy could never place who it was, and she never got to find out. As a matter of fact, nobody ever got to find out. At 9 p.m., On May 28, 1980, Dorothy was attending a staff meeting when she noticed that one of her coworkers appeared unwell. So she and one of her coworkers took their colleague to a neighboring hospital. Their colleague was treated for a snake bite and was given a prescription and discharged around 11 p.m. Since Dorothy didn't want her colleague to walk too far in his condition, she offered to bring her car to the exit and left to go retrieve her car at the parking garage while her coworkers waited for her. Her coworkers suddenly saw her car speeding towards them and they waved their arms to get her attention, but the car just sped past them, made a right turn, and disappeared. And that was the last time that Dorothy was ever seen alive. And it wasn't until 4 years later, on August 6, 1984, when her remains were discovered by a construction worker, laid out by dog bones side by side. Her attacker has never been caught.